Welcome to the Myron Weiner seminar series on international migration, which is brought to you by a consortium, the Inter-University Committee on International Migration, housed here at MIT, but also includes Boston University, Brandeis, Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy, Tufts University, Harvard University, and Wellesley. So we meet several times a semester, and we're really delighted to welcome the first speaker for fall 2023, Professor Susan Eckstein, who is a professor in both the Sociology Department and at the Pardee School of Global Studies at Boston University. She most recently won the distinguished the Latin American Studies Association's Lifetime Achievement Award for her incredible work in the field of Latin American studies and migration and sociology. She's written numerous books and articles on Mexican urban poor, political economic developments in Cuba, Cuban immigrants, immigration policies, and many more. Some of her books include How Immigrants Impact Their Homelands, The Immigrant Divide, How Cuban Americans Changed the US, and Their Homeland, What Justice, Whose Justice, Fighting for Fairness in Latin America, among many other books. I once asked her, how many books do you have? And she was like, I can't really, let me sit and think and count. So this is just a small slice of her achievements. And I'm really delighted that today she's going to be talking about her newest book, The Cuban Privilege, The Making of Immigrant Inequality in America. And I know that she was recently injured and still made it today. So we're really, really grateful that she made the time to be here. And just as a reminder to both the audience in person and online, if you have any questions at any point, please use the Q&A. I'll make sure that we check those out throughout the conversation. So without further ado.
Well, thank you so much. It's delightful to be here. And I look forward to your comments on my presentation, both those of you who are online and who are here. So let me, without any further ado, start my talk. I thought I would just explain the cover to my recent book, which may be interesting to very few people, but for those few, it's very interesting. This here, this doesn't project me. No. Should. At any rate, this is downtown Havana. And though it was illegal to immigrate without a visa, these people are wide open in preparing to launch out to sea. It was just mind-boggling to think that this would happen, that the Cuban government would allow it to happen. And it gave you a sense of the momentum for really a social movement to exit Cuba. So just to let you know
What year?
This I think was 1994 with the so-called rafter crisis under President Clinton. So yeah, because at other times they probably really would have been rounded up. And I think they just this is right after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so Cuba really, economy sunk. And I think in that context, the Cuban government was much more tolerant of people leaving than staying. So at any rate, so let me go on with the show. And let me just, as background, in case you people are coming more for the Cuba part of my talk than the migration part of the talk. It's pretty well known that our current immigration policy, i.e. in the US, changed significantly in 1965 with the immigration reform under President Johnson. And at that point, what happened was the US ended its really racist immigration policy that it had had since the 1920s. And the US was heavily criticized, including in the context of the Cold War, for having such a racist policy. The admissions were tied to the number of immigrants in the country so this is in a law passed in 1920. They used the 1890 census to allot quotas to countries. And by using the 1890 census in the 1920s, there were very few immigrants other than from Northern Europe, i.e. white. So this policy got heavily criticized. And finally, in 1965, U.S. changes this policy. It is a major speech that President Johnson gives, gone through the archives. Where should it be? In front of the Statue of Liberty, et cetera, et cetera. And so just to briefly, I mean, it's much more complicated than this, but what it did was it introduced the so-called preference system that immigrants are admitted on the basis of the various family ties, immediate family, more distant, skills, and money, which Nuala is doing very interesting work on that component of the immigration law. And then they also were a separate admission for refugees, not many, but it was a component that gets taken out of the immigration law in 1980 when the US passes the Refugee Act. At any rate, so it ends national origins as a basis of admission. Well, it turns out Cubans have been privileged in their admission to the United States, even though the US eliminated national origins as the basis for admission. And at that famous speech of Johnson, he says, and now people will be admitted for who they are, not where they're from. He finishes this very elegant speech. Maybe he takes a sip of water, and then he says, any Cuban is welcome to come. At the very time when he announces the end of the national quota system. So anyway, that sort of gives you a sense of Cuban entitlements, unique entitlements that Cuba have had, which is the topic of my presentation. So here's an outline of my talk. I'm gonna give you just a brief sense of Cuban immigration in comparative perspective. Then I am going to discuss some of the unique ways that Cuban immigrants have been privileged, and privileged by both Republican and Democratic administrations, and by presidents and by Congress. So, and then I will describe why they've been so privileged, and then I will discuss recent efforts to retract entitlements. There were earlier efforts as well that failed, and Cuban resistance to the most recent entitlements, just to bring it up to date for 2023. Cubans are a key immigrant group. It's a small country with roughly 10 million people, but they're one of the top 3 Latin American immigrant groups and one of the top 10 global US immigrant groups that come to the United States. And just to give you a sense, there are 1.3 million Cubans who in the US who are Cuba born, and then another roughly 1 million who are Cuban descent but born in the United States. Florida, as maybe you probably know, is sort of the hub of one book called it Havana, USA. So it's really the heartland of the Cuban community in the United States. And just peek at what is to come. Most Cubans have come without immigration visas. Now that for any other immigrant would be you are unauthorized and you don't have basic rights. But this is how most Cubans have come to this. So they come without visas, but have quickly, within a year, have been able to become lawful permanent residents, LPRs. That's what you want to be if you're an immigrant. And so why? Time will tell. And here's just to give you a little sense of, I'm sorry, sorry for the upside down step. At any rate, what you can see here is just to give you a little sense that the admission of Cubans has been uneven from year to year. And so in 1980, there was a major unauthorized sweep of Cubans coming to the United States, the so-called Mariels from the port of Mariel in Cuba. And that was like overwhelming, about 125,000 Cubans came, and it contributed to President Carter losing the election because it showed he was unable to control our borders. So it had tremendous, it's not the only factor that worked against Carter getting reelected, but it certainly was a factor. And then the Balsero crisis in 1994, that's where that picture comes from, the so-called rafters under Clinton. And then, so both of those, the Marielle uplift and the Balseros got huge coverage, every day, New York Times coverage, etc. And then you don't really hear too much about Cuban migration. But look, in fiscal year 2022, over 200,000 Cubans have come without authorization. And it's less in 2023, but this is not the most updated information. So, but it has come down a bit, as I'll tell you later. So what is going on? Here, this table, I think, is very telling because it gives you a sense of how Cubans are coming in, LPR, lawful permanent residents. And what you can see for the case of Cubans versus other immigrants, almost all Cubans have come as so-called refugees and asylees, okay? Which is 17% of all others. Now, these refugees, basically, all they have to come to our border, and they're called a refugee. Come from any other country, and you can just come to our gates, be declared a refugee without meeting the criteria of the United Nations criteria for refugees as being somebody who has been persecuted or has well-founded fears of persecution. In Cuba, for Cubans, all they had to do is show I'm Cuban, and they got in, got refugee benefits, and they were on a path to lawful permanent residence. So you can see really how unique the Cuban experience is. So what are some of the unique entry entitlements? And I'm emphasizing entry at this point. One was about 1/3 Cubans were, quote, airlifted to the United States at US taxpayers' expense under the Eisenhower, Kennedy, Johnson, and Nixon administrations, Republican and Democrat. And this, included Johnson, who announced in 1965 that any Cuban could come. They were airlifted at our expense to this country, no questions asked. You did not have to prove that. All you had to prove is that you were Cuban, not that you suffered from persecution. So that's one. Also, a lot of Cubans, particularly initially, were admitted as tourists when it was known to the US government that they were not tourists. It's much easier to get tourist visas, than you may know, than to get an immigration visa. And so they could come, and once they were here, they were able to change their status and become official immigrants. Cuban, I put the dates, and the thing is they come in all different years. There's actually no real logic to this kind of benefit comes in and another one. So I apologize that the dates sort of skip around. So, and they don't disappear. That's the striking thing too. So under Clinton, he signed an agreement with the Cuban government to allow no fewer than 20,000 Cubans into the United States a year. A minimum number. There's no other country in the world that has a minimum. It can be higher, but that's the minimum the US agreed to. Until Trump decided not to obey the rules, but that was the rule. And then various presidents had invented categories to admit Cubans. Technically, Congress controls immigration. And so, I don't know how obsessive you are in following immigration issues now, but before Biden is trying all sorts of tricks to get around. We can't get Congress to do anything to introduce a new immigration reform. So he's trying various ways to try to get foreigners, not just Cubans, but to get immigrants into this country. And drastically for political reasons, because he wants to get them away from the border, which is politically explosive for him as he runs for re-election. So, and anyway, so here are some of the categories that have been invented, really. They're socially constructed, vocabulary of social science categories to allow Cubans to come in. So Carter creates this category, entrance status permanent, to allow them out, money else to come in. After trying to get them not to come, he tried various ways, but didn't succeed. So doesn't succeed, then he finds a way to legalize them so that they're not all here as illegal immigrants. And then he goes a step farther and creates entitlement programs for them. So they get very, very, very generous immigration entitlements that no immigrants are getting. So that's Carter, then comes Clinton, 14 years later, Soviet Union's collapsing, Cuba's are trying to get out, they're starving, and it's not Rwanda, but it's really bad. Nothing like that had been in Cuba before. And so Clinton's running for re-election already in 1994, the smart politician that he is. He does not want these Cubans in the Straits of Florida. It's just, the news just goes all over. So what he did was he shipped them off to Guantanamo. And then, of course, they start rebelling in Guantanamo. The Cubans didn't go to the Florida Straits to go to the prison in Guantanamo. They wanted to get into the United States. It's explosive, there are riots all the time, etc. So finally, he's quiet down, and Clinton allows them to come as so-called Guantanamo entrants into the United States. And then they get on a path to legal, lawful permanent residence. And then bringing it fast forward to 2023, in January of this year, Biden introduced a new immigration policy. This one is not unique to Cubans, but for Venezuelans, Nicaraguans, Haitians, and Cubans, the four groups. They're massively coming to the United States this year. The economies in these countries are just falling apart. So he allows them to come in. So yes, Cuba is not the only country, but one of four. On the other hand, Cubans of those four are the only ones who can transfer that parole program. Parole is in immigration means temporary entry. Cubans are the only ones who can turn that into permanent residency. So this is, as I said, really up to date on the kinds of entitlements that Cubans are given. So keep going. Cubans have been treated as refugees when not meeting the official criteria for refugee status, and they've been awarded refugee equivalent, very explicitly, refugee equivalent benefits when they were known not to be refugees. And these were some of the times, the different times that's happened. So then Cubans have not had to comply with other immigration criteria. So Cubans, at least until very recently, have been able to enter the US anywhere. They do not need to enter a port of entry, an official port of entry. And very explicitly, it was Meisner, who was Attorney General, specified that in 1999. So again, another set of entitlements. Then under George Bush, a Cuban family reunification program was introduced. Well, what does that mean? It means that Cubans could come in and bypass the queue of people who are in line to come in lawfully into the country through this family reunification program. And then there's this other one that existed from the George W. Bush administration through Obama, called the Cuban Medical Professional Parole Program. It meant that any Cuban who was serving providing medical assistance, foreign assistance for the Cuban government, could apply for their own track to get into the United States from the missions. As a way to sabotage, you could argue, a good program of the Cuban government to provide medical assistance to needy people in the world. So those are some of the entry, okay? Just said entry. Now, what's happening once they're in the United States? Entitlements continue. And here there are two really big ones. So the first is this parole status. And that's been going on. And some people know it as the left foot the wet foot, dry foot policy, but it's had a longer history than that. And it means that any Cuban who touched US soil would be admitted on parole status. That means a temporary admission. Okay, so they already are not going to be deported. They already are going to get work rights. And so they're in safe territory just by touching US soil, which speak to the unauthorized Haitians, Mexicans, etc. They would die for that, privilege to do that. But tied to that also, the twin policy was the Cuban Adjustment Act, CAA. That was initiated under President Johnson, and Johnson really politicked to get this law passed. And I'm just going through the files where I saw. And what the law allows is any Cuban who's been paroled in the United States for 1 year can apply for their status to be changed, to be adjusted to lawful permanent status. Okay, so they're now on a path to citizenship. So those are just the two entitlements that distinguish Cubans from all other groups. So I've already alluded to the kind of refugee benefits that Cubans have gotten. They've gotten more benefits, and they've gotten refugee benefits when they were not, when they were known not to be refugees. And welfare. I mean, the things just go on. When Clinton passed his famous welfare reform in 1996, ending, quote, welfare as we know it, well, it was very anti-immigration, anti-immigrant welfare reform. It specified that unauthorized immigrants never qualify for welfare, and lawful immigrants only qualify after 5 years, except if you're Cuban. It's written into the law. It's on the basis of nationality. So, and that's in effect to the state. So, why have Cubans gotten all these entitlements? Okay, so the obvious answer is Cold War. Unequivocally, Cubans would not have gotten these policies if the Cold War didn't exist. And going through the files, there are really various arguments that sort of popped out to me. So one was, to undermine the revolution, okay? To drain Cuba of its human capital. In addition to that, it was designed, through these entitlement programs to train Cubans to be able to take over a U.S.-friendly government. So administration, also business, etc., all kinds of entitlements they were supposed to be getting. And it was to lure Cubans, to want democracy in Cuba. So it had various components to it, but linked to the Cold War. Well, Cold War ended. And as you've seen, I've already talked about various entitlements that have continued, not only continued, but new ones that have been introduced since the end of the Cold War. So either the argument the Cold War is inadequate, or there's another explanation. And my argument is sort of a path-dependent argument that the benefits that the Cubans were getting during the Cold War created the conditions for them to become a domestic political force to push for the continuation of earlier entitlements and for new entitlements as well. So that's really the heart of my argument. So then the question is, how did Cubans, they are, a key group, but they're not such a large group, how were they able to accomplish this? And my argument is that there are several factors that contributed to it. Well, the first is they became citizens. So they immediately were able to become a political force with voting power, right? In addition to the voting power, and also they benefited from concentrating in Florida. There were Cubans other places too, but they became the political class in Florida, so that really gave them a political clout. They also developed a very effective political action community where they could, they supported candidates who supported the Cuba policies, U.S. Cuba policies that they wanted, which were foreign policy in general, not just immigration related. And here, President Reagan really oversaw this. He had them model their path after AIPAC, the Israeli path, which is a very powerful path. Look at today's, what's going on in the world today, you can see how important AIPAC has been. And so that was one way in which the Cuban Americans were able to be influential. So they had votes, they had politicians, they have a lock, basically. Cuban American politicians have a lock on US Cuba policy. Most important, Robert Menendez from New Jersey. We'll see how long that lasts, but for now, he's the boss, you have to get through him. And the other interesting thing is how Florida has become so much more important during this period. So they're like moving parts. In 1960, Florida only had 10 electoral college votes. Now, the next election, 2020, 30, I can't remember, well, it's after the census. Florida has 30, that's it. Three times as many electoral college votes as they used to have. And it's the third largest, and it's, quote, the largest swing state. I have to say, in quotes, I mean, but it has gone both ways. It was very red in the last election, but Obama got half the Cuban vote, which was amazing in Florida. Hillary, I think, got even a tiny bit more than Obama. So it has been seen as up grabs, and since the state has so many votes, neither Republicans nor Democrats want to write off Florida. So they cater to the wants of the Cuban American community to get their votes. So, okay, so then they indeed have the efforts to track these entitlements. And I'm only going over the most recent, starting with Obama, because Obama, in his last full week in the office, they retracted the full rights that Cubans had. That was a big thing to do. He had nothing to lose. He wasn't running for re-election. And it was actually a time when there was a divide within the Cuban American community, which I discuss in one of my books. So he ends the poll rights. And guess what? Cuban immigration slows down dramatically. But Cubans are very clever. And if one strategy doesn't work, they find new ways to get around it. So when the parole rights have ended, although I should discuss Biden's parole program, which is slightly different, what they started to do was actually follow the example of the Central Americans who were coming and seeking asylum. Never saw any discussion about asylum seeking, or hardly ever, I should say, before. It's not 2017, but let's say 2020s. And so now what Cubans then did was come to the border and say, I'm seeking asylum. Well, for a Salvadoran or whatever who does that, it's a long process. And you may win your case, you may not win your case, but it takes years usually, except if you're Cuban. Because after 1 year, these Cubans who said, I'm seeking asylum, they may not have won the asylum case, but guess what? They can take advantage of the Cuban Adjustment Act and become lawful permanent residents. So that's really what's happened. So, and then Trump comes along and he actually cuts back legal immigration. And it's not so actual. Trump just does what he wants. But there's a bilateral agreement with Cuba from 1994, signed by Clinton, that says a minimum of 20,000 a year. Trump just on his own just refused to give visas to Cubans, meaning they couldn't come legally. Very few could come legally, as few as 4,000 in 2018. Which contributes to the Cubans looking for other unauthorized ways to get here the asylum path, fits into that paradigm. So, and also Trump just admits very few refugees, two, so 0, 1, 2, and another. So real refugee path, according to the Refugee Act of 1980, it doesn't help any Cubans get it. So then we come to the Biden administration, and Cubans don't behave the way the Biden administration would like them to behave. And Biden's, I think pretty desperate because the number of immigrants trying to get into this country is just from Latin America is just huge, from Venezuela, Colombia, etc. And he really, I think, wants to keep them away from the border for the next election. So here, what you can see in 2020, you have roughly 13,000 Cubans seeking claiming asylum. I'm not saying they win it, but claiming, because that's all they need to do, because then within a year, they become lawful permanent residents. It triples in the following year, 2021. Look, it balloons by 2022. It's the largest wave of unauthorized Cuban arrivals ever. 16-fold increase in 2 years. So Obama's effort to stop unauthorized Cuban immigration by ending growth is ineffective. Doesn't work anymore. So why this surge in asylum seekers? Well, it's complicated reasons, set of reasons. Cuba's in crisis economically. I don't think you would want to have to live there at this point in time. It's just inflation, there's no gasoline, there are blackouts, the list goes on, it just some things down. And it's become very expensive if you don't have access to dollars. So social psychological, Cubans don't see a future in Cuba anymore. And everybody knows people who come to the United States, your aunt, your uncle, your workmates, your schoolmates, etc. So people see no future in Cuba, and there's kind of this contagion effect. So I would argue that in political, people are disillusioned with the regime, and I wouldn't put it in the Cold War terms of defecting. I mean, some people may say that, some people just think, it's just at that kind of a level. So that's going on too. And then, very cleverly, Nicaragua has facilitated Cuban immigration. Prior to that time, Cubans, after the parole ended, what happened was Cubans would have to come by land. So initially, Cubans came by sea, right? The Mondials, the Raptors, they were right in the Florida Straits. That's been sort of more or less, not completely, but more or less shut down with the Coast Guard, the police. So, and the numbers are going up, but they're nothing like they were in 1980 or 1994. So there's been this huge trek to the United States. It was initially through Ecuador, which let Cubans come in without visas. And then they had to do like 7,000 trek to the US border. Horrific conditions, dangerous. There's everything. There's theft, there's rape, there's etc. Like Nicaragua has helped out by dropping its visa requirements. So they charge a few, I forget, $3,000 or something, whatever it is, a huge fee to take a flight into Nicaragua. But it's safer. It's that much closer to the United States. So Nicaragua is getting a kickback out of the whole thing. But they've made it easier for Cubans to come in. And smugglers, it is a huge smuggling operation going on, and which digs deep, I think. I mean, I don't have a complete command of it, but it's a huge network. I think an expanding network because smugglers want to get a piece of the pie themselves. And it's just been very hard for the U.S. to be able to get control of the smuggling operation. And then I've already alluded to it, there's a new strategy to offset the end of the parole and micropolitan, that's asylum. So there are asylum seekers, a lot of asylum seekers now, because they see it as a way to get into the United States. It's not so much that people are that their political situation is that much worse. I mean, political situation is that much worse. Economic, social, everything is worse, but it's not specifically asylum-related reasons. It's such a new strategy that the Cubans have turned to be able to come. So here we are, January 2023. Biden's trying to get hold of this situation. And it's at this point that he introduces this so-called 2-year parole program. Again, parole means temporary admission. And it's for those 4 countries that I mentioned before. And it's very, aspects of it are very innovative and clever. You don't need a electronic, you have to apply electronically. You can't come to the border. You can't, if you come to the border, you can't come again for 5 years. So they're really, it's designed to get people away from the border. And also the Biden administration is increasing visa processing for Cubans, which Trump has shut down. But it's still very, very much in process. You need that, or you need sponsors under the program, cost fund, and you need the ties. So their biases to who is able to come in through this means. And then the other thing that it's sort of the carrot and the stick approach. If you come, and if you apply for asylum, you have to apply in the first country through which you go through. So if you're coming from Nicaragua to the Mexican border to get in the United States, you've got to, I guess Nicaragua or Honduras, etc. But these people, that's not where they want to go, right? They want to come to the United States. So this, it's called the asylum, and it's dubbed the asylum ban as a way just to divert the Cubans from coming to the United States and having them go to these other Central American countries, which they have no interest in going to. So we are. So what's the impact of it? Well, it's really, this has just started this year, so it remains to be seen. The available evidence suggests that the number of Cubans coming in has tempered a bit, approximately 131,000, 132,000. And remember, it's the fiscal year, and like, does it end in October or in September? I always forget. So we're up against the end of the fiscal year, but anyway, it may not be. So it's one or the other. At any rate, so it's tempered a bit. The Venezuelans are still coming massively. So the parole program, this new parole program is not working for Venezuelans. And immediately preparing for my talk, I come across a new hurdle that the Biden administration has introduced. Now, maybe some of you know immigration law better than I do, but I've never seen this before. It's called I-228. Do you know what it is?
No, I've never seen that.
I don't know. As far as I can tell, it was just putting another block in terms of trying to keep the Cubans from getting into the country. And so some Cubans are getting in. I mean, that's the thing. They're restricted from coming in, and then yet they get in. Because I think there are a lot of people who are working like for what we call it, CBS, Border Patrol, who, their friends, their relatives of the Cubans, etc., and they hope they get in. So there's a lot of arbitrariness coming in, which makes it hard for the Cubans. I mean, they want to come in, and they don't want to maybe be able to get in after they invested all this time and money into making the trek to the United States. So that's an issue that, as I said, that I just came across in the meeting. But still, despite these barriers, Cubans remain privileged over other groups. So formally, only the Cubans have this unique path to lawful permanent residency. Still, the Cuban Adjustment Act is a law, and our Congress doesn't do very much anymore. And so it has to be rescinded. And there's not sufficient political interest in rescinding it, particularly since the pressure in Florida is for it to be continued. So that continues. benefits still are there. The Biden's 2023 policy allows the Cubans to get refugee benefits. I mean, I can't tell you, I read these things, and it's like a surprise, the things that I come across. So this 2023 policy allows the Cubans and the Haitians to get refugee benefits. They don't have to prove they're refugees. Just by getting this parole program, this 2-year parole program, they qualify for refugee benefits. And then, of course, the Cubans, after 1 year, can become lawful permanent residents. Informal dynamics, I think, also are working to Cuba's favor because their networks in the US are wealthier. So it's easier for them to get sponsors in the United States. And there's a bigger community here. So informal dynamics are working to Cubans' advantage as well. And then there are always legal challenges. As far as I can tell, some Cuban American lawyer is already filing a case before the law is passed. So you never know what law is really going to stand in fact and what isn't. All the stuff is going on. So, in sum, Cubans have received unique entitlements for over 60 years. The entitlements have helped them adjust well to America and give to America. It's not just the one-way process, but they've been able to do well. They've had legal status. I mean, all the work on unauthorized immigration points to how important legal status is. And then they are embedded in these transnational networks that are very fundamental for them to be able to bypass laws, etc., work the laws to their own advantage. And given what Cubans have contributed to the United States, I mean, this is very superficial comment. I think we could argue similar entitlements should be given to other countries, to people from other countries. And also that they should not be unique in the entitlements that they receive.
Wonderful, thank you. So we'll open up, just a reminder to our audience online, please use the Q&A function. We're waiting for your questions. And I have a lot to say, but I think I should see whether there's any questions to get us started.
I have one question, which is, to what extent has the Cuban community organized first to get people, once they have citizenship, to register to vote, and then to make sure that people actually do vote? Is this an area where Cuban politicians, people who are politically active in the Cuban community, play a part? It would be very interesting to know the voter participation rate and the registration rate of Cubans compared to other ethnic groups, especially other relatively recent immigrants.
Yeah, no, it's a very good question, and their voter registration rate is very, very high. It's probably not as high as it was like with the first wave of Cubans who came in the 1960s, who were more politically involved, etc., as opposed to the ones who grew up in Cuba transformed. But the rate is extremely high of registration and of voting. And, you know, the politicians in Miami, they're very aware of this. And they're very effective. And what happened in the last election was amazing, because it did look like the new immigrants were tilting Democratic, unlike the first wave of immigrants. But the last election, the percentage who voted Republican was really, really high. And one of the arguments is that, you know, the Cuban political community was really there to help new immigrants who are coming, help them get adjusted, and help with, you know, integrate them into the Republican Party.
Thank you.
This is something that you may have dealt with in your previous book, but with the newer generations of Cubans, I don't mean the ones who recently arrived, but second and third generation, has there been any marked shift in their political alliances?
Well, I mean, my work has generally been on immigrants. So my book, The Immigrant Divide, was talking about the immigrants who came here before 1980, or came during the Soviet year and those who came in the post-Soviet year. So I've focused more on that. The survey data that I've looked at, it's complicated because second generation, now some third generation, they are their parents' children. So particularly if they stay in the Miami area, that is the political culture of Miami. So it doesn't necessarily make them more open-minded, and my data on attitudes towards the embargo, as part of the culture of Miami is that we support the embargo and it holds up pretty strongly. So, maybe some change, but not as significant changes as you would think.
Great, Franz, and then we'll take.
Thank you so much for the session. We really appreciate the talk. Just out of curiosity, how much of the Cuban community in Florida, in terms of demographic, what is the percentage of Cubans in Florida in terms of the whole population of Florida?
I used to have that on because I don't know, they're the largest group still, okay? But they used to be, I think, about half of the Miami community. It's lower than that because there's so many Venezuelans that are coming, and Colombians, etc. So their percentage of Miami has come down, but they are the main political.
We have a question from online, but actually, I'm just gonna quickly insert myself and say, I think it's really nice to see this for the second time, because I was, instead of focusing on the content, which was all new, theoretically, I think the use of time here is really interesting, because it seems like the why, it's very fitting that you're in the Myron Weiner seminar series, because he would write about how, getting refugee status was less about individual characteristics of people who are getting it and more about the foreign relations between states. And so I think the Cuban example really marks that. But when you're explaining the how, what is so remarkable is this sort of strategic use of counting and miscounting time. And so someone, and by this I mean there are immigrant and non-immigrant statuses, and it's very difficult to move from a non-immigrant to an immigrant. And it seems like a lot of the specific legal strategies that are used here are about accelerating, easing that pathway or accelerating it entirely. So, other groups get blanket protection from non-refoulement, from being returned to a war zone, Syrians, Ukrainians, El Salvadorians, but Cecilia Menjavar's work on El Salvadorians in the US who are on temporary protected status shows that after 30 years, they're still, the minute El Salvador gets taken off the list, they're illegal. And so their time never counts. It never transfers from non-immigrant to immigrant. And I think what you're showing is creating legal pathways that allow you to make that transition from temporary to permanent, and also decreasing the temporal threshold. So only a year for legal permanent residency. Anyway, so that's a long digression, but it's just fascinating how it's
extremely interesting. But
speed,
again, it shows the entitlements that Cubans have.
Right. And the way that migration gets enforced through delays and speed, the Haitians. Anyway, we have people online, so I'll stop talking. But Carol, thanks for your question. She asked, I think you're correct that Congress should extend immigration benefits, but given its interest in reducing immigration, closing borders, do you really think that is even remotely likely?
Whether it's likely, I don't know. Whether it should happen is another issue. I don't think anything's likely with this Congress, right? And we're just living through an extremely anti-immigrant period. So, I think it's very hard to figure out. What you really would need to do is to get Republicans and conservative Republicans to be supportive of an immigration reform, which, at some level could be, because Republican George W. Bush was actually quite good on immigration. It's not as much a liberal, conservative issue. as one might think. But I think at this point in time, it's really hard to figure out how they would see their interests in having a serious immigration reform. I mean, it is tragic, the fact that people can be living 30 years and then suddenly they had some temporary status and losing it. And even if, whether they lose it or not, they worry that they're going to lose it, right? It always becomes a threat that your temporary protective status is going to end. And I don't think there's another country in the world that maybe no more than I do that does that. I don't think
A
European
lot in
countries.
ad hoc ways.
Yeah.
A lot in ad hoc
Yeah,
ways.
yeah. So, I mean, you, in a sense, what I think you are implying is that Cubans are even more benefiting more than one might think, because they don't have to deal with those insecurities. You know, there's some insecurities there, but we don't know. As I said, the Cubans somehow have, at least until date, have managed to find ways to get around the hurdles. So certainly there are more hurdles than they used to be, but nothing compared to what other unauthorized immigrants are experiencing. That's a good point. I mean, it's actually saying that it's not just the objective things that they're getting, but what does this do to their lives?
Psychologically. We have another question from online, but I just want to check if there's anyone.
I've already had one go, so.
Okay,
take the
so we'll
people
take
online.
online and then we'll, so someone who wants to remain anonymous, thank you for your question. Excellent presentation. Can you speak to the power or impact of other immigrant lobbies in DC to reduce the inequalities for Haitians, Venezuelans, or Nicaraguans? Is there any public support in DC for extending benefits to other countries?
Really good question, and I don't feel I'm that qualified to answer it. I mean, there certainly are Haitian advocates, for example. And I mean, to the extent that Haitians have gotten entitlements, they really owe it to some very good work of Haitian rights advocates. Not necessarily Haitians, but it's just, you know, I mean, I think people in Miami, there's a wonderful lawyer there who's worked very closely with the Haitians. You know, it's just so blatantly unfair, the unequal treatment. So there have been advocates, and so some of the benefits that come to Haitians, I mean, it strikes me that Haitians
that's very
are
striking.
included now.
Yeah.
But I think the Haitian situation is so bad that if Biden did not include Haitians among his Youth World program, there'd be unrest. You can't, children can't even be safe in schools in Haiti, and it's so tragic, really, the situation there. So, you know, there certainly are advocates. I think every immigrant group has their advocates because, you know, they want to get entitlements, but they're not equally effective in their ability to get entitlements, partly because the votes, what can they deliver, what's their economic power. So.
Thank you. Any other questions?
I had a question. Economists are always interested in selection, by which we mean, who are the people who choose to leave? Who are the people who choose to stay? And what you've been describing is a world where people are continuing to come last year or before in very large numbers. And I'm curious about what part of the Cuban population is leaving. Is this mostly people with few skills and low incomes? Is it people with education? How much work has been, is there any research on characteristics of Cuban immigrant arrivals as opposed to the Cuban population as a whole?
Right, it is a good question, and probably the people who need most to leave can't. They don't have the resources to leave, like rural peasantry or the proletariat. They don't have the networks, they don't have the money, and so they are very underrepresented in the immigrant population. So people with skills leave. I mean, that's the sad thing for Cuba. They're just losing. They're young. And that's the other thing, because it's so difficult to get here. You're not just getting on a plane and coming. And so who is willing to take those risks? And it's the younger people who are willing to do that. So they are really they're losing their future. It's very sad. You know, a revolution that was born of such hope to create a new world, to see that this is what it's, to do. I mean, you could hate the revolution, you could have lost all your property, etc. But if you really were honest, you would say there was a strong, the younger generation at the time really thought they were building a new world, and it's disappeared.
I think on that point, it's, we forget how expensive unauthorized entry and
Yeah.
smuggling is. Buying a ticket, is a fraction of the cost in business class than, the amount it takes to get smuggled across borders. So, yeah, that is
Yeah, no,
already
I
has
mean,
a section.
I've sort of seen $10,000. I don't know, you get through certain state, it's in parts.
Yeah,
You get through the Darien Gap, then you have to get to the border in this country. So everybody's trying to get a cut.
yeah,
And all that,
absolutely.
but I've seen figures like $10,000. I'm not sure how accurate that is.
Yeah, I think
And
it
that's,
really-
what Cubans, I think the salary in Cuba is.
Around 10,000, but sometimes they, in the middle, in some countries, they ask for more,
Right,
more
exactly.
money, so.
Yeah.
If you have some family, I don't know, someone to help, it's okay, if not,
it's all networks,
you are
right?
in the middle of
Yes.
nowhere.
Mhm. That can't be, we can't end on such a depressing thought. Are there other questions online? I don't have any other, yeah,
Do
please.
you have an online question?
No, I don't.
So my question refers to, in previous answer you had about how the Haitian, specifically the Haitians, what are there networks of legal options for these people? How do the non-Cubans, the Nicaraguans, the Haitians find legal representation to apply for asylum? Is there anything organized, or is it just serendipity that they're able to find a legal clinic or a private company, a private legal office that has pro bono work? How does that work? Do you have any idea?
Work for you to do.
Well, the reason I bring it up is,
No, it's a very
as you
good
know,
point. Yeah.
as you know, I have been sort of serendipitously asked to be expert witness on Brazilians who are applying for asylum in this country. Largely, most of the cases have been for domestic violence that they suffered in Brazil. And, I've been approached by a number of different disparate, either nonprofits, ACLU, legal clinics at BU and Harvard. But what I don't know, and something I should maybe look into, is how are these networks activated? What is the nature of anything organized for these asylum seekers to find the legal representation? I don't know that.
And I'm sorry to say, I don't know the answer to that too. I mean, it's the larger, mainly word of mouth, but there may be some by now on online kinds of
Right. So I'm gonna
information.
look into that myself.
Yeah, fascinating. I mean, I'm sure there's so much movement around, like so many changes in the resources
Right.
that are available that having a,
Yeah, and I mean, and with the internet, things also changed. Like Cubans now, they look for material, to finance their boat or whatever it is online. I mean, didn't exist before.
One thing that was striking in what you were saying, I'm sorry if you want to.
no, there's no
But,
question.
you pointed out that the Coast Guard has really quite successfully prevented the kind of 1 foot on the ground entries that happened in the past. And I remember we had a speaker a couple of years ago who talked about a major effort. I think this was part of taking Cubans to Guantanamo as well. But it seems an odd internal contradiction that the Coast Guard is working so hard to prevent people from entering from the water, and at the same time, the flow has increased so enormously by land.
They're related
The greater fortification.
because of the crackdown by sea. And it has picked up by land. That's the order, is the sequence in which it happened. Under Clinton, when 1994, running for president, he is really trying to get people out of the streets of Florida. And apparently it's just that the media just loves that. I don't know, they don't seem to like it. They've been trekking by land over 7,000 miles, but they like it by sea. So it's just considered politically bad, political publicity to have people in the Florida streets. It's very unsafe, sharks and things, that everything's unsafe. This trek by land is unsafe too. So anyway, I mean, there is a correlation. The fact that there was a crackdown on policing in Florida states led to, and it's another example of how the Cubans have been so ingenious at finding new ways around obstacles. So they couldn't go by sea, so they worked out with the help of the smugglers, etc., this long, dangerous trek by land. It's picking up, though, I have to say, by sea, but nothing like it used to be.
I'm just curious if in this political tightrope that you see Biden walking, you see any, even a nod to the US's role in the situation that's forcing people to migrate here, like Venezuela and Nicaragua. I mean, obviously Cuba with the embargo, right? And Haiti, it's not unrelated. I mean, it's different in terms of the relationship to the regime, but US intervention in Haiti and what it's done to the situation here. But my point here is like, if Biden were even to consider lifting some of the, incredibly harsh blockade on Cuba and sanctions on Venezuela and Nicaragua, like, is that less politically feasible than having, immigrants at the door?
Such an interesting question. And to that point, Biden just today announced that that he will lift or restrict the embargo on oil to Venezuela if Venezuela has free and fair elections or something like that. So it's sort of in the spirit of what you're saying. The only thing I've seen publicly, the president of Colombia, lefty, he really publicly has come out blaming the United States for the immigration crisis, as opposed to Colombia being responsible for whatever.
I mean, and this isn't even mentioning the brutal civil wars in Central America, Guatemala,
Right,
Salvador,
exactly.
the
No, there's no question.
So, but it's just that's always so absent of any
And
discussion.
again, I mean, everything's political, right? I mean, so Biden's not going to do anything that he thinks is going to cost him votes.
Right.
So
What's interesting for me is in that political calculus, the huge waves of migration, which would not be good for him, is still preferable to lifting sanctions that are causing, collective suffering.
well, there it comes down to money and power. It's not. It just seems to be impossible to end the embargo. I mean, Obama came closest,
Mhm.
and then Trump has retracted
And
the
Biden
steps.
kept Trump.
Yeah.
Any last questions don't think we have any online. So join me in thanking Professor Eckstein. Our next, I don't know if I hope you've signed up for our listserv, either in the room or online. And we have our next event is going to be on December 5th. Professor Usman Balkan is coming, and he's going to be talking about a new book that looks at migrant deaths from the perspective of funerals and how bodies are taken care of. And so it will be a really provocative, I think, and interesting conversation. I hope you can join us then too. Thank you.
Thank you.